What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to FudgeMuppet. I'm Scott here with Michael Drew. As always, this is the Elder Scrolls podcast, and today we are talking all about the needs. And you might need some elaboration on that for people who aren't into the... Because I guess it's like needs doesn't come up often if you're just playing the game.
It doesn't. And we're talking spelled N-E-D-E-S, not needs as in wants and needs, or I need this. But they need an infusion of Elder Scrolls lore straight into their veins. So the needs are basically a very, very ancient, primitive human race. And they're the predecessor to Imperials, but potentially other races, as we'll talk about. And there's a lot of theories about them. Some say that they were always in Tamriel, and then you have the theory that they came to Tamriel from Atmora.
Yeah, well, we gotta, two also, so needs, to understand needs too, is like if you were to compare it to a real life culture to help understand, it's about as useful as saying Celts, as in that, like Irish Celts or French, Gauls or Hellstack Celts and all of that, they have some broad notes and broad strokes that are similar, some sort of biological and like language ties, but they actually form quite individual cultures themselves. So the needs, and it's just the one term that we've got, needs is kind of like the equivalent of Celts. There's lots of certain geographical areas, like there's the needs of the Deathlands or the needs of Black Marsh or Cyrodiil and stuff like that. They all have quite distinct cultures and stuff. Of course, there's some broad similarities, but the more like...
They're kind of like indigenous, well, if they were always in Tamriel, but that energy is kind of like indigenous groups all over Tamriel that all have different subcultures.
Yeah. There's two, sorry, you go.
Well, I was going to say, and if we're talking about migrations as well, there's differences of thousands of years to the point where, we can kind of go through the details of the evidence of whether they did migrate from Atmora or whether they were always there. But it really doesn't actually have that much of an impact on who they are as a people anyway. It doesn't actually matter that much. I think there's when the Imperials had Talos, Tiber Septim come along, who they believe to be their Atmoran emperor, there's kind of a reason to come up with an excuse for why all needs and the people of Cyrodiil originated from the same place in Atmora, so it kind of justifies their emperor. But for the most part, whether or not they came across the ocean or were always there over the span of thousands of years of developing their own culture almost becomes irrelevant to who they are as a people, pretty much.
I guess the thing as well that makes it feel extra irrelevant is that they're not really around anymore. Mm-hmm. In the sense that they were. It probably mattered a lot back then. For example, if they were always in High Rock, and then the Durrani elves came to High Rock, found the needs, and then enslaved them, versus the Durrani being established in High Rock, and then the needs coming there, and the elves are kind of like, okay, you can settle in our lands, but we're basically gonna make you these low-class citizens, and you'll do what we say. That creates two massively different stories. But like you said, either way, at the end of the day, what happened? We got Bretons. So
yeah, but I'd argue that all of it is incredibly important, and it challenges the elven narrative, which is the dominant narrative traditionally and gone through all cultures, which when the more you can poke holes at the traditional elven sort of Aldmeris, the whole old Elden of Hay story, we were all the Tamriel and the races of men came and ruined everything and that kind of thing, you get a much more nuanced look at all of Tamriel when you're not just taking, it's as simple as Auriel and the gods went down and baddie Lorcan stuff. So when you bring in the idea that, needs might have actually been here all along. Maybe actually even the Bosma were here as the Ooze before, and the Argonians and everything. And then these high elves that came and then just colonized and dominated in all these different cultures are actually deluded as hell, and they sort of just put their sort of dogma to everyone and sort of influence all of the cultures that buy into this sort of other thing, where it turns out that all of the, if we go with that theory, that the native needs and the native Argonians and the native Khajiit and everyone that's native to the land, they were wrongfully there, man. This was always old Elnefey, like Tamriel, until your gods came and ruined everything along with it. I think it does inform a lot.
It does seem like what I was getting at is that even if they came from Atmora, most of the evidence seems to suggest that when the High Elves made their migrations from Somerset, they were coming to places where they could subjugate already settled populations of human. You know, so like if there were, obviously the evidence suggests that there were migrations, if there were migrations and they weren't native, long before Isgramor came along. So these lands that the Doreni came to, that the Aelids came to, were settled by humans who they were then able to take as slaves, right? And I mean, in some areas, which we'll get into their religion, you can see pretty clear signs that some of these newly migrating elven cultures actually were influenced by the Needs who lived there prior in terms of their own spirituality going forward.
Hey, as Maik the Liar says, wood elves aren't made of wood, sea elves aren't made of water. Maik still wonders about high elves. Perhaps they are not so high and mighty after all. Perhaps their narrative should be challenged. I will say...
They're all just high, so they're making it all up.
That's kind of what the... if you go read about his quote specifically, I kind of disagree sometimes with what it's said to be a reference to. Like, that is said to be a reference to being high. But for me, it sounds much deeper and more interesting if he's kind of making a little note like, oh, what if they're not as like high and mighty as they make out? Also, did anyone else see the shadow behind Scott? It kind of looked like an elven helmet when he was... It just kind of went past in the window.
Yeah.
Propaganda,
but to pull
they're here to get him.
To pull some nice, like, a basic sort of look. So there is what they call the out of Atmora theory, which is kind of the idea that all humans that exist on Tamriel come from Atmora. And then the other one is that they're indigenous and that they've, like, kind of always been there in some form. And then there's obviously later migrations of the Nords and stuff. And in some ways, it could easily be a combination of both, in the fact that there could be indigenous groups of people, of humans, in Tamriel. Then, later in the Merethic era, there were additional earlier migrations from Atmora, which then intermixed with the Needs, which would have just been blanketed, called Needs. And then Nords which come as a much more distinct sort of race later on in the history.
Basically, Atmoran kind of race.
Yeah, but I think there's things that it's like one of the, like, the biggest, like, thing in the video I did recently, like sort of a prehistoric Skyrim looking thing, is you have this sort of medallion of Kothringi origin found in Blackmarsh. And the Kothringi are the silver-skinned races of humans, which are sort of even encapsulated in that sort of Nedic branch. But that dates back to the early Merethic era, which would place them before Elven arrival. And additionally, there's also a statue of Sithus that appears to have been made by Kothringi craftsmen, and it's the Argonian depiction of Sithus with the egg and everything like that. And so that would sort of imply is that the Kothringi were there way back when the ancient Argonians were there, having their big empire and stuff that was all revolving around Sithus worship and so on. And then they, made that in cultural exchange. But this places the Kothringi, like, on Tamriel way earlier than the dates you get in the books like Frontier, Conquest, and so on, which says, like, 1,000 to 800 ME, which is, like, 1,000 to 800 years before the First Era begins.
Do you think that there could be a bit of confusion where kind of the two sides of this theory could be true partially each? Because if we are to say that the Needs are kind of all grouped together for almost convenience, because let's be real, the Kothringi are like a silver-skinned race, right? Like they don't look like how you'd imagine other Needs look.
Yeah.
And so it could be that they were there, but the ones up in Skyrim weren't.
Yeah, it's possible.
And that would kind of be like, okay, they could have come from Atmora, and different Needs could have also been in Tamriel.
And so beyond that, the other thing is also just the chronological, like, if you're trying to make sense in a broader, like, the idea that the Needs were indigenous, I think at least, makes a far more coherent and cohesive, understandable story. That it just feels rather strange that, in the Aelids, there were no Needs there first, and the Needs get all into their lands as tribes and cultures before they're enslaved. Same as the deal with the Doreni, or in other areas. It's like, how did that kind of
they're not gonna let them settle there in the first place.
Yeah.
Especially in the kind of numbers it would require to make a society like like a big one.
And
like you can imagine that if they were being taken and forced into slavery in Cyrodiil, for example, by the Aelids, why would more just keep coming to actually give them this big, force. It really does feel like they would have to be settled there first.
They need to
and
be able to
integrated
properly before before
And
they come along.
Additionally, there's also other kinds of like connections, like with things for the stars. Like, so it's a thing across Nedic cultures. There seems to be a reasonable fascination with the stars. You find it in the celestials and so on. But this is found across quite a few Nedic tribes. And then if you had the idea that maybe they were native sort of star worshippers, or stars was a big part, kind of bringing in the Aelid fascination with the stars, which really began when you had the Aelid divergence from the Somerset sort of high elf kingdoms. So when you have that divergence, it's like, where does that appear from? And so maybe they sort of took this fascination of these tribes they conquered with stars and stuff, and then they started to, pursuing those avenues, and then that's when they created the Aelid Wells and the Welkin Stones and the Power of the Stars and such. And then also, if you go look to the Reachmen, and this is their story, so it's once again it's mythology, but they believe that they've been there long before Nords or Elves or anyone was in the Reach and the Cave stuff. So it's just another little, and obviously there's bits and pieces all over. There's little like relics or bits and pieces all over Tamriel that will just sort of nod to like humans being there.
There's, I think, one example from your video, Scott, was a pair of Nedic dueling swords that were found in the possession of like basically like a Draga Lord character who, is from ancient times. Yeah.
So the idea there is there could be a few things. It could be either that that you have this sort of Draga, because there's ideas obviously too, which is true. Like you have the later Syro-Nordics, and Syro, as in like Cyrodiilics, are a derivative of Nedic blood and such. So there's obviously going to be intermixing and breeding and stuff over time, which create new sort of ethnic distinctions and so on. But that sort of could have been like a relic of like maybe a grandfather or something that was like a full-blooded Nede or something, and then they married a Nord, and then it went down again and got passed down. The other thing I was sort of getting at is that potentially it could be quite old, and that this Skyforge here could even potentially have been a Nedic megalithic structure, and then there's this unique, metal stuff, and that's why they were quite profound at metal creation, despite the fact that by other metrics they were considered the needs of Skyrim were considered primitive and so on. And there's also the examples of like other but later tribes working with Hircine to build like other powerful forges, like the Bloodroot Forge and so on. So
I mean, also even look at the Dyraki needs and all the Nedic kind of structures in Hammerfell. They're quite tall and rather advanced. It's not all Forsworn feeling. It's not just tents and totems and things like that.
The Dyraki needs are kind of the perfect way to get a good idea of what the needs were like before they were kind of affected by the elves, because they were the most kind of the culture that managed to survive despite all the kind of foreign invasions. And you had them creating these relics because they had their cult of the stars, they worship the stars. They were creating these relics from Ethereum crystals, which is essentially the same material used in the by the Aelids, just kind of referred to as meteoric glass, but the idea is that they're the same thing really, and that achieve the same purpose. So that the idea that you've got kind of some of the Cyrodiil based needs, like the is it the Men of Gi? Are they based? Yeah. They're based in the Men of Gi. You can associate that with the Magna Gi, who are like the Star Orphans as well. The idea that the Aelids come along, they suddenly develop, they consider light to be one of their elements, which the High Elves don't generally do, makes a lot of sense if they're coming along and stealing the culture of the local needs.
Also, just to throw out a quick clarification for people too, most resources in regards to the needs are from the first era, or sort of shortly before and stuff, because you still see the last of the needs. So the last identifiable, really strictly almost like Nedic cultures are things like the needs of the Deathlands, the Dyraki needs they get called, which is just named after King Durak, who was their last like high king. And there's a few tribes around it, or like the Keptu people and such, but there's all these different Nedic tribes. But the reason we have, relatively decent records of those is because it's all during the time of the Elysian Empire and the Skyrim's Empire of Nords and stuff like that, where there's much more scarce information going back, but it's really interesting to try and bridge these pieces. Like I suggested in the video that, for example, like in the first era, by the time of 800, there is the existence of this forest king Kestic, and there is a Nedic tribe called the Men of Creeth. So the assumption being that, Men of Creeth, as in Falkreath, later on, Forest King Kestic of this place. And if you can sort of say that, oh, well, there were needs here, then you can kind of, if you go with an indigenous point of view, you can imagine that further back there is evidence for them.
It's also interesting
precedent,
too.
Sorry.
When you're talking about there being different kind of like better records kept because of more recent needs, and then the older ones are kind of like more lost to time. It is interesting that when you look at the totems of Hircine, that they are said to kind of predate men's ability to write, speak, and properly think. So they're these super ancient kind of artifacts. And then you look at the fact that in kind of Nedic derived cultures like the Reachmen, they worship Hircine, and then you actually do see kind of Nedic symbology with like horns and antlers and very like Hircine looking kind of things. So it's almost as if they could have easily worshipped Hircine, and it would make sense as to why the historical records get, you know, so cloudy, because they couldn't write, speak, or properly think.
That is the other thing that is of significance for the Skyforge in general too, is that we have, you know, as much confirmation as we get, it predates the Nords and it predates the Snow Elves, because the Snow Elves believed it to be a relic of the gods, but it's kind of like, well, what if it was actually some sort of like magical construction of needs that predated Snow Elven arrival even, and then, you know, they pick it up and like, oh, it's of the gods or something like that.
And like we said, it's not far-fetched considering that they did forge things and build impressive structures in various places. It's not like they couldn't have built, you know, that forge.
That's kind of what I sort of like say in the video. It's like you've got all of these like Neolithic structures like Stonehenge and Newgrange and pyramids in our real world where we don't have magic and gods and stuff like that. It's not so far-fetched that they can build a big bird forge thing or something like that, or the megalithic standing stone kind of things with magic and gods and stuff like that as well, because to be honest, even visually they kind of pale into the, you know, comparatively to like, you know, Newgrange or pyramids or stuff like that, because it's just a simple stone up or something like that. You know, it's got carvings and stuff on it, but there's a lot of, you know, cool stuff. I feel like there's a lot of new like real world research that could be applied to like to sort of the needs and so on, but like there's lots of new cool there's a book I'm reading called The Dawn of Everything, which has a very interesting take on like all of history and stuff, and like packaging it differently and stuff. And one of the main things is that this idea that hunter-gatherers or that large societies can't exist without agriculture and trade and stuff. And there's lots of evidence for, like they call it Göbekli Tepe is one in Turkey and so on. But as far as they can tell, they're hunter-gatherers that have built and somehow coordinated these big stone structures and so on. But there's also ones that they found in like near the Mississippi River and so on. I forgot the name of it, but these big sort of like stone formation almost feel like, you know, mini cities of that time. But as far as you know, they're you know, indigenous Americans, and they were constructing those, but they were living like hunter-gatherer lifestyles and so on. And there's some really interesting things. A lot of the focus of it is talking about agriculture versus hunter-gatherer, and rather than it's this clear technological development, like this idea that hunter-gatherers that stayed hunter-gatherers it wasn't just like, oh, agriculture comes along and they get exposed to it, and then all of a sudden it makes 100% sense and it's the best way to go, and like people like, you know, flirting with the ideas and stuff. But still, like, I wonder if that could be applied to needs or so on. Just to the point I was trying to get at there is that if you can imagine like hunter-gatherer needs of Skyrim, but then they could still come together and build these sort of stone structures of ritual significance, or you know, even, you know, metalworking, depending.
Well, and it touches back onto something we discussed before, but when we're talking about history in the Malefic era and before that, almost all of the perspective comes from the elves, and it almost all comes from Somerset. So at the end of the Dawn and the early Malefic times, we're seeing so much stuff happening on Somerset and the effect that will have then on the mainland. But meanwhile, we're not really getting any information from the mainland, you know, and what gods, if any, the natives are interacting with, and the fact that there are, you know, like we've mentioned with Hircine, there are cultures on the mainland who seem to have affinities with certain gods who weren't necessarily present on Somerset during all of the conflict between, you know, Auriel, you've got Trinamac, but we feel all that stuff going on and the divergent groups coming from that. we don't know what's going on with the natives.
Even the Aelid's descent into Daedric culture just sounds like another like Nedic inspired thing. You know, like you look at that, it's like, oh, the Aelids who went to the elves who went to Cyrodiil and became the Aelids, you know, oh, they got interested in stars and light and Daedra and everything very different to, like, you know, the Altma or the Oldma of the Isles.
To clarify there for people too, is that there is sort of, we like to work with this theory or so on, that Daedric worship is far more prevalent among the Nedic, early Nedic tribes and so on. And the reason being is that if you treat the Reachmen somewhat, they seem like they could easily be an isolate. Like there's connections in the video made with the totems of Hircine and how it could relate to Hircine, and you know, there's later Nedic Keptu tribes that work with Hircine and stuff like that. But if you envision the Reachmen as the only sort of cultural isolate, just given by their geography and so on, that they've been able to stave off a lot of elven influence. And then if you look at also the needs of the Deathlands, they weren't necessarily, but they did have their own different systems of worship. But the reason being is that, you know, you got the High Elves there, they come to Cyrodiil, and then they, you know, obviously become Aelids eventually, but the Nedic slaves of the Elysian Uprising had no connection to their traditional faiths. They were worshipping purely elven gods at that point. So, and their dominant faith, the imperial cult, which would come from Elysia, is a mixture of later Nordic things, which are from the far north, and the elven gods, whereas a lot of their stuff doesn't exist. Their traditional, whatever, original worship doesn't exist, and the whole Daedra distinction, remember, is an elven idea. It is our ancestors or not our ancestors. So they put them in these neat little piles. Like, you don't get the same thing with the Khajiit. You don't get the same thing necessarily with the Argonians, or you don't get the same thing with the Reachmen, which, according to their histories, and which are all oral and stuff. So, you know, but they believe they've been here since well before.
So would you say that they wouldn't have gotten any Daedric inspiration from the Needs then, in Cyrodiil specifically?
Or maybe
because their fall to Daedra kind of came later, right?
I bet I was going to say, yeah, they did, but like maybe initially or something. Or this is the thing.
That's the thing. One mage gets into it, and then later he becomes high ranking and spreads it. Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
And also at the same time that Elysia is setting up this new religion that mixes the Nordic with the Elven, you're also simultaneously getting this covenant, which is supposed to make it more difficult for Daedra to access Tamriel, to access Nirn, whereas prior to that, you know, before the Imperials came along, before the Elves came to the mainland, it's much more likely that the Daedra could come and go as they please and interact with these early needs, as we've gotten through the story of Molag Bal with the origin of vampires, for example.
Exactly, and mentioning that silver medallion too of the Kothringi before, this is depicting Clavicus Vile and other Daedra, so it's indicating like Daedric awareness as far back as early Merethic era, and then obviously, like, you know, like you're saying, Molag Bal and other, so many other possibilities. But that's why we kind of like to go with this. It's not even, I wouldn't take it as a certainty, but there is evidence to sort of suggest that this might be the case. It could be they might have some abstract mix of entities that they don't know as Aedra or Daedra, but they're just like, you know, oh, Hircine, oh, Namira, oh, Kine, or some other name that they go by, because there is also evidence for I love this, the fat bee mother and the ox and stuff, but there's these interesting sort of other deities that we don't really understand or know exactly what they are. There's obviously some comparisons you can make, or certain influences, like I sort of talked that perhaps, you know, the fat bee mother is some sort of Mara-like interpretation, and then that somewhat backward when the Red Guards came, that actual like iconography actually influenced their version of Morwa with like the beehive and stuff and all of that kind of stuff, honey. But
I mean, like we've said before too, there could be more than 17 Daedric princes as well.
Yeah,
like there's the possibility of extras. Like, who knows what deities are being worshipped on Akavir, or, you know, places we don't know.
This happens with everything all the time across any science or any kind of stuff. You create the best model that you've got with the available information, and you test it and so on, and it might work. But then all of a sudden, something happens that breaks the model, and then you're like, oh, that doesn't work. And now you need to try, and you can still use this as, it's still got purpose and use, but you got to understand that it's not perfect. So now you've got to adapt your model and sort of start working.
And it's also kind of human nature to not want to mess with the established canon, the established ideas. You know, I mean, it's a bit of a digression, but I'm reading a book on kind of like the first circumnavigation of the globe at a time where they didn't know a Pacific Ocean existed, because they were going off like old Greek models of what the world looked like. And then they're like, they start to get evidence that kind of contradicts everything, but they're too scared to actually embrace it, because it seems like what you already have, it's infallible. You can't argue with it, and that's kind of like where the sciences develop, eventually being able to deal with the fact that we don't know everything.
Yeah. Speaking of navigations as well, Topol the pilot,
perfect segue.
Did
Well done.
zoom around Tamriel, and he did see a lot of interesting things, which also question the kind of idea that the elves were there first. I mean, his whole thing is, I'm going around and there's these bird people in Cyrodiil, and, there's like kind of Khajiit sounding beings running around. So, if we take that as canon, and the Aelids did wipe out the bird people or the bird men, and then that's potentially how they developed their kind of like bird-like or feather iconography in their armors and different things like that. There's just a lot of like examples of, elves, and any culture gets developed or influenced by where they go, whether they're on the offense or the defense, like no matter what happens. So I wouldn't be surprised if I just think they definitely they copied the needs, man.
Yeah, there's a lot. It just overall it does make a lot more sense, I think, rather than like, because otherwise it's like, imagine that the forefathers of the Reachmen and everything, they're just like, they just come over like thousands of years or at least hundreds of years after the Durrani, and then they just sort of like go to the mountains and then they're all over High Rock, and it's just kind of weird. And they've also got to spread all into Cyrodiil and other parts. Well, by the way, we should also mention and talk about, someone I think on the comment of the video asked about, would it be possible to do like a prehistoric Morrowind or something. It's not possible or something, because there's so little information. But there is, I think it's the Rontha tribe is identified as like a Nedic tribe in near Morrowind, like a Morrowindish sort of area.
It gets iffy.
Yeah, and potentially if you try and like things with like bridges of travel, and you've sort of got like, Kothringi down here, and then you've got like Skyrim and Cyrodiil north, it's possible. But it's also interesting, the idea that like what's going on in Morrowind before elves, so before Dwemer or before Chimer and so on, and then
what you need to make? You need to just make a video called Skyrim - National Geographic. And just go with go with the whole thing you did for the prehistoric Skyrim theory video, the music, the animals, everything. But just do the animals of like, I don't know, Tamriel, and just do a whole documentary. I would watch that.
Yeah, I've got to have an interesting take or something for it.
No, just make it like an encyclopedia, and we'll...
David Attenborough, if you're watching, you're allowed to narrate it. We'll let you.
Yeah.
Just this once.
But I guess, so just to establish again, the remnants of needs that you have now are basically, it's Imperials in their background and Bretons in their background, and to some degree, obviously, the Nords with any sort of interbreeding and stuff like that, but they're obviously identifiably Nords. So needs as any sort of, there is no culture that exists anymore that is, identifiably Nedic. Because funnily enough, I would consider early Elysians Nedic still quite for a while, until until they really became an empire in the form of the Elysian Order and expanding, and then Imperial seems fitting.
When you look at Imperial culture specifically, and you have this whole idea of like Colovian and Nibonese, you could say that Nibonese has the most Nedic derived influence, despite it still being quite different to like, obviously. But they probably would have much more in common. Like the Colovians feel more just like the Nordic influenced Imperials, right?
You know what? That's a really great point thinking too. But you know how but you know that the Nibonese in general, like, they're closer to the Nords are far more that influenced the Cyro-Nordics, which became sort of like Colovians, far more, stalwart, and like they've got their imperial divine cult, and they're very uniform and such. But the Nibonese, their general cultural mindset to begin with is very accepting of lots of different cults and practices and bits and pieces everywhere, quite an eclectic mass of cultural individuality. And if you would apply that sort of thinking, and if there was some sort of earlier consistency with earlier early Nedic groups, that they did have that far more like open source approach, like, oh, you know, a little Daedric bit here, a little bit of veganism here, a little bit of whatever kind of mix of cultural sort of elements and stuff. It might actually be a little bit more telling of how the early needs might.
Hey, and here's a super take, and then they evolve into the Empire, which becomes cosmopolitan, which is basically, you know, accepting of all different cultures. I think that's a far stretch, but I was just rolling. I was just rolling with it.
That's the one other thing to really point out about like the fighting the elven narrative is that even with the uprising of the Needs and stuff in Cyrodiil, which would become the dominant sort of man influence to a degree. I guess the Nords were for a bit earlier, but at least a mix of those two, is that fundamentally they've already got the elven influence and stories there. They are completely disconnected from their sort of heritage and stuff, or as far as we can tell. So you've already got the elven story jammed in there in the foundation of the most central human powers in Tamriel. You know, I mean, they even use the writing and language and stuff of it. Like, I think all legal documents or something were in Altmeri language until, like, Riemann sort of reign or something like that. But you're looking at thousands of years of, you know.
Hey, imagine if the elves were actually right all along. It'd be so annoying for them, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Like, yeah.
I mean, most believe their story, but it's just funny if, like, all this, like, conspiracy and challenging it, and it's, like, all wrong.
Yeah. Well,
but I believe, I honestly lean much more towards the idea that at least some needs were definitely there before elves.
And it's not beyond the idea that a culture that is values around like higher castes and essentially elven supremacy might create stories and versions of events that support the idea that they are the superior race.
Even the fact that they have this kind of like supremacy idea very much sounds like we go here, oh, we're better than the Needs, so we're allowed to do X, Y, Z. It sounds like it could be like more that version of events than, oh, we've been settled here for ages, and here come this like Nedic group of people. We're superior to them. They're like if that makes sense in terms of like the whole cultural caste system and things like that. I know that's within their own society as well, but just their kind of like snobbishness.
Yeah,
it seems much more of a like.
And funnily enough,
thing they take with them.
Actually, here's an interesting connection there, is that obviously elves are obsessed with the idea that they were descended from gods and that the closest to godliness you are in terms of bloodline and such like that, the higher caste you are. But there's maybe a good argument to say that they introduced the idea of castes based on religious, like godly lineage or association. So whereas if you imagine there's the Nedic tribes and stuff, they just, there's all these powerful spirits and different things and data or whatever, and we worship those based on, but there's this very separate identity from the elves. But whereas the elves come in with their sort of haughtiness, it's like, no, we're close to the gods and so on. And then they introduce these ideas which actually become foundational even for the Empire, because one of the justifies your place as Emperor in the Empire is dragon blood, which is a blessing of Akatosh. You are chosen by the gods. So this idea of basically like religiously, like godly ordained rulership might have come from the elves in general.
And I guess the strength of your pantheon and how much it endures has an impact on that as well, because if the elves make that argument and the Nords continue to worship their pantheon, well, who's the closest to the Nordic pantheon as they're portrayed? They're portrayed essentially as Nords, you know, Sun and Stun and Shor and all of that. Well, if you're saying that whoever's most closely associated to the gods is the highest race, then the Nords are the highest race, if you are using their framework. But it's kind of like how you interpret all of these gods, because all these gods, it's like, well, no, they're not necessarily elven or human. You know, they don't have shape. We don't know the shape of the ears of the gods except the way you depict them. So, so it's kind of a very arbitrary way of
myth
looking
makes
at things.
reality, though. So they're constantly praying, and their like ears are going like this and smaller, and it's like a big battle.
And especially how fluid it is too, even with the, like, for example, like Sheogorath appearing to the Khajiit as a little Elfique, or to varying to that. Like, they kind of choose, they appear and manifest how, you know, it's in the eye of the beholder almost, you know. Like,
and as a slight aside, when we're talking about kind of how most of the Nedic cultures have either assimilated into other cultures, or with the exception maybe of the Reach folk, aren't really present anymore, it's almost a shame that it seemed like the Dothraki needs of the Craglorn region could well have endured long past their expiry date if it wasn't for a single high elf. There was one high elf who was their entire undoing, essentially, because you've got the Regarda waves coming at Vermeeril the Betrayer. Yeah, you've got the Yakudan waves coming across. And it almost seemed like they could very well have, if not staved them off, at least kept their own land. But there's this one high elf advisor to King Durak who believed he was eligible to marry this woman. He was denied, so he murdered every single one of the Nedic kings in their council, weakened them drastically, and then the Yakudans came along and just wiped him out after that. So it's funny how one high elf was the downfall of potentially the strongest Nedic clan.
Also, in terms of like the chronologically about the Dothraki needs, though, because like you're sort of saying, is the Yakudan waves the Regarda was really like their downfall because of the elves, the elven interference there. Well, that one character, they would have had about 600-ish kind of years of potential interaction with the Elysian Order and stuff like that as well. So it would have been interesting to kind of see how that went down, and we don't have any records of this, but the real reason is because this law was developed in ESO and it's come like much later. But like it's just interesting that there would have been. So maybe they would have had some sort of, but like attachment or to some potential like older Nedic cultural notes. Like that's the thing too, is people think, or at least I used to a long time ago. Like you when you hear Elysian Order, you just think, legions and everyone's just Roman looking and everything again. But you got to this thing was like, they have minotaurs and stuff in their thing. Like you look at the depictions of Elysia and she looks far more ancient with these big horn depictions and stuff like that. Like they were a far more ancient in vibe people, and like aesthetically they would have looked different, not just like, Imperial Legion soldiers of
all this lore kind of aligns with the idea of it being a rainforesty, jungly kind of biome that they existed in. I lose track of what we believe, whether or not is it a jungle? Was it always grassland? Was it retroactively dealt with? Was it Talos who did it? I don't know. But all of the lore associated with Elysia and the rebellions and kind of like the bird people aesthetics of the early Aliens, it does seem to suggest that this kind of grasslands, Imperial Roman inspired culture came along later.
Yeah. I mean, funnily enough, like you could put it down to climate change, but like look at things like honestly, but look at things like I think it's the Sahara that basically every 10,000 years or something turns into like a lush jungle and everything has different weather patterns, and then obviously in the last couple of thousands of years it's been in a dry patch or something, so it's functionally become a desert. But climate does actually change a lot faster than you think in terms of history. Like, you go, like, people were walking across to Ireland and Britain and stuff by land bridge. Like, there was entire, like, country mass that was there that's now subsumed by water, and it cuts them off. So it's not out, and especially with magic and stuff like that, but it's not out of, and maybe also like, maybe they went slash and burn too far with like clearing land for cropland, because, it happened in America, like, the big, like the Plains Indians and stuff, like a lot of that area used to be forested and so on, and they'll clear it. It's the same as like Scotland and Ireland. Like a lot of this area used to be forested, but they cut it down, like human intervention, and and that changes the landscape as well. And I mean, it goes for every sort of animal or anything like that. Like elephants can drastically change the landscape depending on their destruction.
But I suppose you can't change like the species too drastically, right? Like, I mean, you look at Cyrodiil, they are not jungle trees. They're like very...
Yeah. At the end of the day, this is all really hard cope for different design decisions, but it's it's nice to try and work with it. It's funny to imagine. It's like, us as Elder Scrolls historians, it's just giant copium farms of like, no, it's coherent, it's good. It's just, yeah.
I got my tank on the floor for after the episode finishes. Just gonna pop the mask on and inhale nice and deep.
To be deep in Elder Scrolls lore, you have to mainline copium. You just have to. But so needs.
There's obviously like the kind of stuff that we haven't really gone into depth with yet is stuff we've covered in other episodes, like about the Aelids, for example, and everything with that. and
The Bretons
the
and
Bretons
stuff, yeah.
and stuff. So if you want like a huge dive into those specific cultures, check out our podcasts on those, or our just normal YouTube videos, which we also make, believe it or not.
I guess just talking, I guess there's the Dothraki needs. There is probably the last identifiable, like, sort of isolated feeler, like definitively Nedic culture, like high Nedic culture, like, because the Reachmen kind of get walked all over, and they're probably closer to what maybe they looked like primitively, earlier in the Merethic era. But with a big part is there that they were known as incredible stonemasons, and they made like Skyreach Hold and all of these giant towers and stuff that are still standing into the Second Era. With all those kinds of things too, like that's what another thing is, if you think of that art form as an acceleration of previous megalithic structures that they made, like the Doomstones of Cyrodiil or the Standing Stones in Skyrim, or the Munda Stones that are everywhere, and potentially Skyforge or other things. But the idea that they've obviously have some sort of fascination with stonemasonry, and they'll even make barrows and burials going underneath the ground. But then again, this could have been Nordic influence, because the Nords were like really great stoneworkers as well.
Well, it's
like
also, it's convenient the Aelids are remembered for having such incredible architecture that endures over the hundreds and all the centuries that pass. And they were using needs as slaves. You can imagine they were giving them, telling them exactly how they want their architecture, and it's the needs who are actually making these fantastically survivable structures.
I also feel like thematically that's really cool if you have functionally like these primitives, like if you just had like Stone Age tribes across all of this. I also want to say like Godikil, I guess, I think some people have said it, it's not like using the word primitive or something, it doesn't give it, because you can have theoretically a Stone Age thing that could be quite culturally advanced or religious, like all different kind of stuff. It's hard to, obviously we use it, people generally use it based upon just technology progression. But anyway, you have the like Neolithic sort of Stone Age sort of Nedic tribes everywhere and so on, and then that thematically like stones, their kind of thing feels kind of cool, like the ancient thing.
Well, because
like
when we use the term primitive, we're kind of in the real world we're associating it with like the evolution of humanity from kind of like from ape, whereas that's not a thing. It's primitive is literally just meaning in the past in the Elder Scrolls universe.
Yeah. And so that's a cool little insight there. The needs were responsible for everything, man. The Aelids just jacked their entire culture. They took the stonework, they took the stars, they took the Daedra.
Elves are overrated. Humans are superior.
The Telvar stones? That's Elder Scrolls Online added lore, kind of like what White Gold Tower is made from, but some kind of
that's right,
magical stone that's imbued with like the power of creation itself or something like that. It gets all very mysterious and whatnot, but they are said to hold this vast magical power inside of them. So the Daedra were trying to chip away and remove the stones for whatever reason, probably for fetch quest reasons. But it is interesting that that's what that tower's built of. And you have Adamantine Tower, which in Elder Scrolls Online just looks the same, right? It's just like a big
that's the thing.
White gold tower looking thing.
I can't remember who it is. It says it might be Baradelmo the Signifier. It says something like the structure of the Adamantine Tower after being analyzed by stonemasons is like that's not something that could possibly have been humanly or like mortal constructed as proof that it was made by the gods. So if the White Gold Tower is actually designed by the same specifications, then it would have to use magical stone in order to be possible. It
just looks very similar. That's all. I mean, maybe the elves did build it. It's just it's a giant spire up into the sky. If you look in Daggerfall, it's just like this like stone boxy building. But in the Elder Scrolls Online, the Durrani Tower definitely looks much, much closer to White Gold Tower.
They're just to like. This has changed the topic, so I don't want to like jump in if you guys had trains of thoughts. But in regards to the Black Marsh needs, it's interesting. Like, so obviously there's evidence that there's for Kothringi being there since really early on in the early Merethic era. But there are also other tribes identified, such as the Orma, which are a tribe, and apparently they were born without eyes, becoming masters of their other senses, and survived beyond the First Era. Which is interesting. It's another biological difference, like in the same way there's silver-skinned Kothringi or something. The humans have been there, and then also there is the Hawali, which is another tribe that the Adapts are seen as, like, the idea is that they were sent there as prisoners or maybe refugees from other wars or something like that. And there's the Yespest as well, which have been contemporaries with the Barsabic Aelids and stuff, who, remember, are a group of Aelids who were Aedra worshipping exclusively and then fled. They didn't like the Cyrodiilic descent into Daedric worship, so they went over there. But again, just the sort of interconnectedness and so many different Nedic tribes, I find it so hard to believe that they weren't there for a long time. Like, there's so much, you know what I mean, variation and stuff. It just kind of sounds strange to me that humans first came 1,800 years before the first era. Then they, like, run on down a black marsh, turn into silver skin, and then they're like, we're the Kothringi.
And we know how much the Nords they wouldn't really ever part with their culture, and the idea that these these humans that were born in the snowy wastes would then inhabit the humid jungles is a bit odd. But it's kind of similar to trying to justify how the Bosmer exist. Like, how do they exist if they started as high elves? You could make the same argument for Nedic migrations from Atmora.
Yeah,
it's all a bit sus.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of things to build out different theories, and also talking about, just to throw it so people don't think I'm like some mad anti-elven kind of ideal too. The Nords do the same thing. They come here and then they're like, their stories conveniently aligned with everything. Like, oh, we were breathed onto the throat of the world. Skyrim's our return home. This is our land, and all this kind of stuff. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
You know, it's all a process of colonization of the both, and it's interesting that basically Nordic and Elven traditional pantheons become the most dominant forces.
Battle of the copes. And the harder you cope, the stronger you shape reality.
Yeah, you just summed up the entire history of the universe, both real and Elder Scrolls.
That's it. But there are other little tribes. I don't know if there's any, like, some are just kind of boring. Some are just like, oh, this was a Nedic tribe.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've covered all of the most interesting ones.
Yeah.
Ones without eyes, ones with silver skin, the ones that were involved with all the different elven, cultures, and obviously the Reachmen, who are believed to be, descended from Needs, but, mixed with all kinds of other races like Bretons and stuff.
We talked too about the whole some different parts of the mythology, the whole, like, the Ranev, the Coal-Eyed Wanderer. I think in our Ancient Gods podcast we talked about that, a renowned warrior and spear maiden, and the whole, like, different stories and stuff about, like, the snakes rising out of the ground and eating everything, and we connected that to potentially, like, Akatoshi sort of Alduin kind of destruction stories.
I tell you what, if the Elder Scrolls 6 is set in Hammerfell, we better be able to go in some ancient Nedic ruins.
Dude, as if Hammerfell isn't, like, the best. Like, you got the normal cities, you got the Four Bear Crowns kind of stuff, which also ties in nicely with the Thelmor conflict. You've got Orsinium as a whole city, which could just be awesome to see. You've got Dwemer ruins, you got ancient Yakutan ruins, you got ancient Nedic ruins, you've got I think there's even some limited Aelid ruins and stuff. But you have so much potential for variety and everything. It's
a good spot. I hope they do it well if it's there. But yeah, I think that brings us to the end of the Nedic episode of the Elder Scrolls podcast. Thank you everyone for watching. If you want to support the channel, we've got links to get our merch and support us on Patreon in the description. Social media links are there too, and we look forward to nerding out with you again very soon.